So I've had the privilege of knowing and working alongside Monika Johnson-Hostler since 2010. In her role as Executive Director of the North Carolina Coalition Against Sexual Assault, Monika represents 90 rape crisis centers. She represents college campuses and many other constituents. In addition to running CALCASA, Monika is the president of the National Alliance to End Sexual Violence. She and I are partners in transformation as two of the three original founding and managing partners of Reliance. And if all of this weren't enough, Monika Johnson-Hostler recently announced that she is a candidate for North Carolina's 2nd Congressional District.
All right.
So we can all see that this is a woman of action, and I'm sure she'll be happy to talk to any of you all at the end of this session. I'm not promoting, I'm just saying.
That's right.
So, yeah, please, let's give a warm welcome to a fearless leader right here, Monika.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Sandra. And I will echo her sentiments. She wasn't promoting anything since you don't live in North Carolina, as a reminder. However, those are facts, and those are many facts that many of you in this room share with me, because I'm also a daughter of a single parent, I'm the wife of a teacher, and I'm the mother of a 13, almost 14-year-old. I should call her a semi-storm hurricane, maybe. Her birthday's 9/11, but she's turning 14 next week. But she also turned my life upside down. I had been working in the anti-sexual violence movement by the time I was pregnant with her for 15 years. And it was the first time in my life that, so I should also start, my life is very planned. I'm a very sequential, organized person. So every decision I make is bound by reflecting on what I should be doing next. And so reflection is something I spend a lot of my time doing. I also credit to being an only child. I had lots of time to reflect. But I planned to be pregnant at 30. I was pregnant at 30, but what I didn't plan is being on bed rest for 6 months. And so this little storm took my life by storm because I didn't plan that. And I share that with you because at that moment I realized that my entire career had been dedicated to community, to ending sexual violence, to being a public servant, and to being a person that was willing to use my voice when other people felt voiceless. And most importantly, I was willing to use this fast-talking Southern North Carolina girl, kick the door down and sit at the table or stand at the table, depending on how you would have me. Those were things I was willing to do because those are things that I watched my community do for me my entire life. And so much of who I am is a reflection on the people before me. And I've done exactly the same thing in this work. There are many, many, many of you in this room, like Sandra, who've been doing this work far longer than I have, and at this point, I'm 44, and I've been doing this work for 23 years as a paid employee. And I think that's important because I started this work in 1995, and I started at a rape crisis center that was started by a county government that turned it over to a nonprofit, to the county manager's wife and me. I was 21 years old. I say that to say that at no point in my life did I think that I'd be starting an agency at that point in my life, talking about something so critical to my community as a Black Southern woman, but more importantly, to a career that my grandmother, who had a hand in raising me, saying, "Who is going to tell you that they were sexually assaulted?" And I said to her, "I don't know who will tell me, but I know what the statistics say, and if they don't tell me, I'll still act. I'll still do the work until communities are ready to talk about it, invest in it, and be in this with me." Because what I do know is every individual impacted is in it. They are in it not by choice, but because this horrific incident happened to them. But what I learned very quickly by stepping into the first Black church in this rural community, saying, "Hey, I'm a Southerner and a Christian too," because that matters in the South. And I'm here to talk to you about, I didn't say sexual violence, I said, "I'm here to talk to you about rape." And people were like, "Okay, that's a big 4-letter word." And they actually let me in to talk to their kids about how and what role do they play in leadership? Because that's how I approach this, is if we invest in our children and give them the tools that they need to change and transform the world that they live in, then we can actually end sexual violence. And I believe that at 21, and I believe it at 44. That we absolutely invest in the generation that's younger, that is before us, to give them the tools that they need. That's who I am. And I share that story because that's a reflection of who I am. It's a reflection of how I come to this work. But more importantly, it's a reflection of why I have all of these multiple organizations and titles attached to me. Because I believe that standing in the gap for people until they can do that. And I think Paul hit right on it. I've spent the last 10 years building CALCASA to be an organization that could survive without me. Because unfortunately, when you're at an organization for a long time, it becomes synonymous with you. And what I do know by endeavoring on running for school board, which was my first election in 2013, is that I hired and worked with people who were brilliant, who could do the work without me, but what they needed to do is for me to not physically be there. Because sometimes, like children, they have to actually be able to do it without you standing there, to see that their role and how they are transforming to become the leaders that they are destined to be. And that's exactly what I did in 2013. And so today, when people ask me about all the titles and all the jobs that I have before me, I say to them that I've had the great privilege of working with a group of people who can create an organization that is responsive to the community. That every Monday at 10 o'clock, we meet to talk about what does our community need, what do survivors need, and then what do we need as people in this agency to be healthy and whole. And one of the things that we've come to, very similar to Paul's story, is our work is bigger than ending sexual violence. We've always known that survivors come to the doors of Rape Crisis Center needing more than the health and wellness that we're giving them through our sexual assault trauma treatment services. We've always known that. But what we didn't do is connect to the organizations that Paul talked about to meet the needs of those people. We gave them a referral, right? Because that's kind of what the protocol says, is we're going to connect you to other organizations. And what I know when I ran for school board is that for me was the real transformation for our organization to prevention. Because if I knew that if I got in the schools, not with children, but with decision makers, that we had the ability to transform lives, that we had the ability to start as adults holding the responsibility for the world that we create for our kids. And so what did I do? The first policy, I was like, we're gonna teach parents about sexual violence, but we're gonna call it all these other programs so parents can come. Guess what? 6 years later, we are still teaching this to every pre-K parent that enters our 163,000 student school system. Not because I did it, but because I understood that I needed the leadership to be invested in the same things that I was invested in, because they already were. And just like when you talked, Kenya, about Priya, what we find is when we push through the barriers, that at the core of all of our humanity, we all want what's best for people. Especially if we're in this work in any way, shape, or form, whether we're working in the prison industrial complex or we're working on behalf of ending food insecurity or climate change. All of these are forms of social justice that we just hadn't connected the dots to. And what I'm excited about is you talked about those of us, yesterday you had people, what I call outsiders, who are doing anti-sexual violence work in their organizations in the ways that make sense to them. But more importantly, today you're talking to insiders. Right? Kenya, Paul, myself, we are you. We are a part of this mass movement that we call ending sexual violence, and we are all connected and interwoven into our communities in ways that we should be bringing to our organizations every single day. We should not be walking into our Rape Crisis Center as the Rape Crisis Center advocate, the volunteer coordinator, the prevention coordinator. We should be walking wholly who we are, representing all the organizations that we believe are necessary to create whole communities, and that everybody's humanity gets to shine and be at the table in the ways that they choose to be. That's who we are. That's what your conference is about, and that's what I believe that bio that you hear about me, that's what it is. And when Paul talked about climate justice, I started laughing because on our call, I said before the Hurricane Dorian that is visiting me currently in North Carolina, that knocked out my power, that had me miss my first flight, but I am here. I can defy the odds of climate injustice. Truly, I think it was destined that I'm here because I needed to hear actually Kenya and Paul. So that's the thing about doing this work, is that you're before people to share your story, but inevitably there is a nugget for you in everybody else's story. And I know you know that from just the work that we do in the anti-violence movement, but that's what happened for me sitting in this space. So I'm running for office and hearing Kenya say that you just keep talking to them, that it might take 10 of you before you need a security guard, but you are in community with people, and sometimes you just have to keep pressing and reminding people what their role is and what your role is and the ways in which they intersect. Because once we identify ourselves with our role, we forget that we actually need other people to carry out the message. And so that's what I took from you, Kenya, that in this fight that I'm doing to connect all forms of justice, that to connect that for our rape crisis centers across the country, but for us as individuals, is sometimes we have to remind people that our roles are dependent upon one another, whether we see it or not. And to Paul, to start that organization is Sandra and David and I are part of a group where we've been talking about how do we connect all the ways in which people can have healthy whole lives? How do we transform them? And that's what you've done. You've transformed your community by creating a social service organization that meets the needs of people, of whether they're hungry or they're having floods. Like in North Carolina, we've had record number floods. So for people who don't believe in climate change, I don't live in a floodplain. And guess what? My insurance is now like, you live in a floodplain. Because it's real whether we like it or not. And so those are the things that we know to be true today. So what does our action look like? What do we take from Kenya, Paul, my sharing my childhood, my adulthood, and now where I am today? What are we asking you to take from that? I'm asking you to think about the ways in which you can act here, the ways that you can act here, and then the ways that you can act here. Right? Because once you start acting from inside the heart, because the heart always tells us what to do and it tells us to do it right. We just actually sometimes get right here and don't do that. So I'm asking you to connect those things in your own mind and body individually and think about what the action is for you today. That action may be as simple as, I'm going to go back to my office and say, we are not just a rape crisis center, we are a beacon in our community, and how do we connect the dots to the other beacons in our community? Because there's not just one. Because human beings don't just need one thing. So that's the first thing I'm going to ask you to do is, what can you do? What is going to be the thing that you do to make those connections? The second thing I'm going to ask you to do is, how are you going to make that action true in your organization? Right? What do you give? What do you bring to your organization to really transform the ways that you've been doing your work? And what I know to be true is, because I know your leader and your leadership here at CALCASA, that you're already making those steps to transformation. But what is it that you could do organizationally to stand firm in transforming today? Don't put it on your strategic plan that you're going to do it in 3 to 5 years, but what can you do today? Because there is something you can do, even if it's as simple as saying, I'm going to call our, in North Carolina, we have our food banks. I'm going to call them and see what their research says about how they work with families who are insecure and have trauma in their homes or in their communities. Or bigger than that, one of the things that we've done in North Carolina is look to our climate justice folks, because we've had so many hurricanes and tornadoes touch down in North Carolina, is how is this impacting people? And how many of you, we all remember Katrina, I'm sure. Well, that's what we've started to talk about in North Carolina, is what we saw with Katrina is sexual assault survivors being re-victimized in the dome in New Orleans. That's what we saw. We all watched it on TV. So we're saying, how do we prevent that in North Carolina? So we've started a lot of work with our climate and environmental organizations to say, when people are being moved from their homes because of floods or tornadoes, what do we do? How do we intervene? How is the anti-sexual violence movement a part of our rescue and restore communities? Because there is a role for us. If we know that 1 in 4 women and 1 in 8 boys have been impacted, there is a role for us. Because we are most vulnerable when we are moving and when we're transient. And that's what happens when we have any type, whether it's a fire or a hurricane in North Carolina, that's what happens. People become transient, they lose their homes, and then they are most vulnerable. We know that. And so if we know that, why haven't we been at the table? Because we've all been our own personal beacon. I've been a beacon to end sexual violence. They've been a beacon for climate justice. They've been a beacon for food insecurity. But what we forgot is that individual whose house is flooded, who was removed, don't have renter's insurance, not sure where they're going to live, and the food bank has given out all of its food, and they have their own sexual trauma reinstating and revisiting their body because now they have some other uncertainty in their life, that if they come to us today at a rape crisis center, what is our action? What do we do? How do we connect those dots? And what I, unfortunately, am here to tell you is I don't actually have an answer for you. But what I do have for you is the forethought to say that we should be thinking about that today, because the generations before us, as we reflect, didn't see ourselves in a rescue, restore, and emergency management model, but we should today. So as a school board member, last year I was school board chair, and we had all of our schools set up as emergency shelters. Well, when I went into those schools, I went in there to check our building, because that's my job as a school board member, but guess what else I did? I took the cards of our local rape crisis center and said, if you need these, here is their number, and they're willing to come here. Now, guess what I didn't do? I didn't ask the rape crisis center if I could do that before I did. So the first call they got, they didn't call me. By the 10th call they got, the ED called and said, hey, so we heard you gave out our cards at a shelter today? And I was like, yeah, I did. I mean, I thought it was a great idea. And they said, well, we've had 10 calls. Why? Because what happens to us when our body holds trauma? It revisits us when we're experiencing another traumatic event that may not be the sexual violence, but it may have been the loss of their homes that required them to need the support that day. And so guess what? Whether our local program likes it or not, but they love it because they do know that. They do. They are a huge part of now all of their community efforts. And that's the role that we want us to all be in. And it takes us some a little slower, which is fine. We all take our pace. But what I will say is what I hope you get from the 2 days that you've heard both the outside folk, and we're going to call them outside today, but quite frankly, we're together. And what it takes is both those on the outside and inside to create the world that we all hope to live in. And as Paul said, that's one of love, compassion, and community. And when we do our work, that's what we're working for, is to create communities full of love so that every single person can thrive and survive in a community in ways that we couldn't have imagined 30 years ago, but today we can make the action to actually create the communities that we all want to be a part of. And that's what I hope you take from your days here, and that you take and hold some piece of something somebody said that helps you decide what the personal action will be and then what your larger action will be in your community. Because I know that you're all in this room listening to my voice, because that is our charge, is to do something bigger than ourselves that you already do every day, but think about how you do that in community. And our community is much larger than we've ever imagined before. Our community now is without borders, right? So from North Carolina to California, guess what? We're community. Just by virtue of the way that people live their lives through internet, through transportation, we are all community. And once we remember that we're all community and borders don't define that, then we are unstoppable. And for the competitive side of us who likes our beacon in the anti-sexual violence movement, you can be the leader of that, and then you do what Paul did and what I'm doing, and you take a step back and watch our community survive and thrive in ways that we couldn't have imagined. And so I'm looking forward to watching across this country how we continue to grow our communities in ways that we didn't imagine before, because you're all gonna take a single action that starts right here and right here today. Thank you.